Hi, I thought I'd take a few minutes to talk to you about Chapter 11. We finally made it to Chapter 11 where you get to do the hands-on, kind of what you've been building up to all semester. We'll pull all this together. So I thought I'd spend a few minutes and talk about some of the details in Chapter 11, much like I would in the classroom. So I'm going to go through just a few sections of Chapter 11 online. One of the first things I wanted to talk about was the actual features on a Cisco router. And if we look at this diagram here, you'll see you have several ports, and you'll need to be able to identify these ports not only for maybe some of the multiple choice questions or identification on the Cisco Academy quizzes, but just in general, so that if you actually see a Cisco router in a classroom, that you would know what it looks like. This router is the same model that we use in the classroom, and you'll see you have several ports. Okay, you have serial ports right here. Okay, and serial 1, serial 0. Okay, sometimes they'll be listed as serial 001 or serial 000 on a router. Okay, you also have some fast Ethernet ports here. Okay, these two. It's hard to see those, but they're probably listed as FE. Okay, and they could be fast Ethernet 01 or fast Ethernet 00 ports. Okay, you also have console ports. This is where you would actually connect to via some type of workstation or laptop in order to configure. Okay, and so the rollover cable that you learned about in the last couple of chapters, this is also called a console cable. It's Cisco proprietary, and this is what you would use here to do the initial configuration on the device. Okay, the serial would be used here. Okay, and once you get these configured, you can actually telnet through. So those are the various ports. Here's the power supply. You'll see this here. This is the switch, which you actually turn it on here. Okay. Now there are two types of configuration files which you'll be using in Chapter 11. Okay, and that is your startup config and your running config. Now these two are a little bit different because your startup configuration is the file that's used at the beginning, and it's copied over into your running configuration. Okay. Your running configuration is just like on a regular workstation, where you're using your RAM. So it's your files while you're working, say, in Microsoft Word, for example, on a workstation. Unless you actually save those files, though, doing the save as command, they're erased when you turn the computer off. So the contents of RAM is erased. If you save it in NVRAM or non-volatile RAM, it is saved. Okay, so on a router. So that's the equivalent of doing the save as command on a regular workstation. Okay, so you'll actually see during the process of Chapter 11 a command to copy from the running configuration into the startup configuration. Okay. Now this slide actually shows you the various modes of the iOS commands. iOS, Internet Networking Operating System. It's Cisco's version of their operating system. And there are several different levels. The very first one is the user exec mode. This mode is the most basic level. Okay, and the router command prompt would look like a greater than symbol. At this level you can ping, you can do show commands. It's very limited. Okay. In order to do anything more complex, you would need to go into the privileged mode, and I'll show you how to do that in the lab and in the next recording. So at that command you can go into configuration, you can debug, you can reload a router, and you can ping here as well too, and do some telnetting. And at that mode you can go a little bit deeper into the other router modes. You'll see these here, your global modes. Okay, so that would be displayed using the config and then the pound sign. Okay, and that's when you can do all your configuration. And if you go into config if mode. These are all the interface changes. Config router would be the global router commands. So this would be like your routing protocol that you would be using on your router. The config line is used for setting line console passwords or telnet passwords. And again, you'll see that and be able to use that throughout the chapter in each of your labs. Now, one thing to remember when you're looking at the prompt structure, so to speak, in your command line interface mode is that you need to know at what prompt you can use each command. You'll see here you have the user mode, then on this line here you have the privilege mode, and then you get a little bit deeper into the router. Now, you need to start memorizing, if you haven't done so already, at what prompts you can use which commands. Because even though you know you can go in and enter an IP address on an interface, you need to know which prompt you can do that. For example, we see here the config if. You have to be at this prompt in order to enter the IP address on a router. If you try to do it at your user mode or your privilege mode, so in here, it won't be accepted by the router because you're not at the right mode. Okay, so learning which prompts you need to be at are important not only for the hands-on configuration, but also you'll start seeing these in some of your Academy quizzes. It'll ask you what prompt you need to be in or what's the command to enter the IP address for an interface. And then you might have 5 options, and they'll be at different prompts. So you'll need to know which prompt goes with which command. And this is more information on your iOS mode, so I suggest that you read through these. Okay. Now, 11.151 is showing you how to use help. One of the cool things about a router, although you're using command line mode, which can be a little bit harder to get used to at first, it's very literal, and that, you know, if you're trying to enter an IP address, you type IP address. Okay, and then whatever the address is. And one of the neat things that it does give you is a help menu. So you may not be able to use notes, for example, on the CCNA exam, but you can use the help menu. It works just the same as it does in a regular router or packet tracer. So here's an example of that. So if you're using the help menu, you can type CL and question mark, and that will tell you what commands begin with the letter CL. You can also type the word clock, space, question mark, and it'll give you a list of prompts, basically one command, of words that come after the word clock. Okay. Now, a router doesn't necessarily give you information about if you've configured something wrong, but if you type in a command wrong, it does let you know that, incomplete command. So incomplete command would tell you that there needs to be something else besides this clock set here. So clock set and do a question mark, and it tells you need to actually give it a time. So you do that. And then here it also tells you need to do the day of the month and the month of the year. Okay, so once you actually do the entire command, it does take it. Okay, and as you'll see when you're configuring a router, if it doesn't give you an error message of some sort, whether it's incomplete command, invalid input, that sort of thing, it actually does take it. So right down here at the bottom, clock set 1950-0025 June 2007, this person has hit enter and they're back at the Cisco command prompt again. So that means that the router did take the command. Okay, here's more information on the error messages that you might receive if you put in the wrong command. An ambiguous command means that there's not enough characters, it doesn't recognize the command, so you didn't finish typing out the command, for example. Incomplete means you type part of the command but not all of it. And then invalid input detected. Okay, and it gives you a marker. That marker tells you exactly where you kind of messed up at. So in this case here, the 6 was incorrect. So it gives you a little bit of indication. It gives you a little bit of help as to what you did incorrectly. Now, if you want some keyboard shortcuts, here's where you can get your keyboard shortcuts, and I would definitely recommend using these. For example, this tab, if you're typing out a command, you can start typing the word CL for clock, for example, and if you use the tab, it will finish out the command for you. Okay? Or if you're typing address and you type the first few letters, it will complete that command for you. Okay? And there's a lot of other keyboard shortcuts that you can use here, and they're not required, but they do make life a little bit easier. Okay. For example, the up arrow, if you're in the typing in commands, it keeps the last 10 commands in the buffer for the router or the switch. So you use your up arrow and you can just go through each of those commands. It does tend to save time. Okay. I don't always like retyping. Okay, so once you've done configuring and you want to use some show commands, here's a list of all these show commands. Not all of them, but quite a few of the show commands. And we'll be using those in the lab. So I'll be going over some of those. One of the nice things about Cisco routers and switches is that the commands are the same. So you won't notice any difference between using a router, excuse me, using the router and configuring that as opposed to doing the switch. The commands are the same for showing or for doing host names. You'll really only be able to tell by the router prompt. So routers, if you boot these up and there's no configuration on them, it will actually be indicated router and then say the greater than symbol or pound sign, depending on what prompt you're at. Switches will be the same. They'll say switch, and then the greater than or the pound sign, depending on what mode you're in. Okay. And they work exactly the same. So now I'm going to go over to 11.2.2. Okay. Now, getting into some basic configuration, I wanted to go over the difference between enable passwords and enable secrets. Okay, and I will show you a demonstration of this in another recording. Okay, so when you're setting passwords, we need to set various passwords for different reasons. Okay, setting your console password will keep someone from actually going in and just plugging in a console or rollover cable and making any configuration changes they want to. They'd be able to access what you have on your device easily. So we can set up a console password. You can also set up a telnet password. Why would you do that? Because if you don't, anybody can telnet into your router from anywhere and make whatever changes that they want to do. And you won't have any knowledge of that. You can also set an enable password. So if you'll remember, when you go from the user mode, you can't make a lot of changes there, but when you get into the privilege mode is when you can start making configuration changes. So you'll want to put a password between going from your user mode to your privilege mode. And there's two different ways you can do that. You can set an enable password or you can set an enable secret. The difference between enable password and enable secret is that the enable secret is encrypted. Okay. Enable password, if you look at your running configuration, you'll be able to see it in plain text or read it right on the screen, which is not very safe, because you'll be able to see the password and not access anything. So anybody looking over your shoulder would be able to see this. Enable secret will encrypt it so that you won't be able to read it in plain text. Okay. So that is just a brief overview of a few things in the chapter. I'll talk about a lot of those in another recording where I'll actually go kind of start to finish using the command line interface mode to configure a router. Go a little bit more detail in that, but I hope this has been a little bit helpful in going over some of the content.